Hey, what's up, viewer? Thank you for taking a look at this video. In the last video I covered the game object creation necessary for this Pong recreation. In this video I'm going to be going over creating the different UI elements for this Pong challenge using Unity's UI Toolkit and UI Builder. So without any further ado, let's get into it. First thing we're going to do, of course, is we're going to open up Git, and we are going to switch back into the proper branch. So if I take a look at Git branch, we see we have the master branch that I'm on and the Pong challenge branch. I actually figured out a cool new way to switch branches, which is by using the git switch command as opposed to the git checkout command. So we'll use it here and we'll say git switch Pong challenge. Switch to branch Pong challenge, and we'll go over here. It's going to ask for a reload. I'll say yes, and now we have all of our objects back. As I was practicing for some of the other videos, I wound up erasing the Git branch that originally had the objects, so the objects might look a little different here, but fundamentally everything is still the same. Alright, so to get into making the UI, the first thing I'm going to do is make a new scene. Because we are generating a start screen as well as a game scene, we are going to need an actual start scene. So the first thing I'll do is select the scenes folder, go to create scene, and I'll simply call this start. Then I will open up the start scene. Now that the start scene is opened up, the next thing I've got to do is run a couple of configuration parameters to actually get the UI toolkit to work properly. This requires a few components in the hierarchy and a few new assets in the project. So the first thing I'm going to do is select a game object, in this instance the main camera. I'm going to click add component, and I need to add something called a UI document. By default, what this is saying is this is not going to work unless you have a panel settings asset. We don't have one yet, so the first thing we need to do is come down to Assets, right click, Create, go down to UI Toolkit, click Panel Settings Asset, and we'll just simply call this Panel Settings. Then go back to the UI document and put that panel settings in there. The next thing we need is something called a visual tree asset. To create one of those, we will go to Assets, Create, UI Toolkit, click on UI document, and this is going to take a second to compile because it has to, I'm assuming it's actually compiling some of this UXML, the UXML template. So here we're going to just call this start UI. Now we have a visual tree asset that we can plug into this source assets category. So select it here, or drag it in if you'd like to, one way or the other. And we now have our UI document properly set up for the screen. If we forget to do this, what's going to happen is when you come here to Window, UI Toolkit, UI Builder, you can actually get into the UI Builder and start to build into your UI. The problem though is that once you build the UI in here and save it, it will not show up in the screen. To actually get it to show up in the game view, you have to actually use this UI document on a game object. One more thing we need is we also need an event system. And to get that, we will right click, go to UI, and go with the old school event system. However, one thing that's a little different, because I'm using the new input system package, we have to go into this event system and make sure that we replace it with the new one. And we'll do this, and then that's going to be good to go. Real quick, I will also make sure that I select the event system, push W, and drag it out of the scene so it's not in the way there. I will also select the main camera. I will go to the camera option and I will check the the environment. Click skybox, change it to solid color, and I'm just going to change the background to black, which matches the game scene. Alright, now that we have all of this set up, the next step is to actually build something using the UI Builder. So you can go up here and go to UI Toolkit, UI Builder. The way I've kind of started preferring to do it is to just double click on the Start UI, option, this actual, whichever visual tree asset you want to take a look at, double click on it. And what that will do is it will automatically open it up in your hierarchy. Once you have this open up, click on the Start UI.uxml, select this Match Game View option, and this will actually match the size of this canvas to the actual resolution set in the game display. Zoom it out just a little bit to match it to the view. The next thing I'm going to do is select Canvas Background, switch to the Camera option, and select our main camera. It's not as big of a deal in this beginning screen because there's nothing there. This will make a lot more sense in the game scene. Now that we have this opened up, we can actually start building stuff using the UI builder. The first thing we're going to do is go down here to these control options and grab something called a visual element. This is more or less effectively a panel from the original UI system. It's basically just an empty container that's invisible. You can give it certain properties like background color. You can change its borders. You can do all of this stuff. It's very similar to CSS style. However, for the most part, this is simply acting as a base element. So all we want to do is go to the flex option and change its grow property to 1. And what this does is this causes it to fill its container all the way without having to manually change anything ourselves. Now that we have this set up, the next thing we're going to want to create is it's functionally a panel for the title and the start game and exit game buttons. So to do that, we will take another visual element, drag it up here, and nest it under the default visual element. I'm going to double click it, and I'm going to call it Start Panel. Then I'm going to go down to Label and drag a label onto the Start Panel. And I will call this, I'm just going to call this Title. I will go over to the text and the title and change its name to Pong. And I'll zoom in so you can see it. It says Pong, it's pretty small. We're going to want to change that size. The first thing we're going to do though is we're going to reposition the start panel. Because we have these flex options through the UI builder, I'm going to avoid doing manual positioning like this and try to leverage some of the flex options given to us by default. And the way to do that is we will go to the containing visual element of the start panel. We will go to the alignment option, and we are going to select the center align items, which, as you saw, move Pong to the center. And then we are going to select the center justify content, which puts the Pong option directly in the center of the screen, which is very convenient. Next, we are going to change the background color of the panel. It's showing up gray here. However, the background is black, as we can see down here. So we will make the panel background white by going to background color, changing it to white. And then to make sure the text is visible, we will select the text option. Although, make sure that we select the title, then select the text option, and then change the text color to black. And now we see that the Pong color changed to black. It's pretty small though, so let's raise the size, and something like 55 is probably pretty good. Next, we will scroll down to the other control option, which is a button. We're going to drop 2 buttons onto the start panel underneath the title. These will function as our start and exit buttons. So let's select the first button, change this to start. Select the second button, change it to exit. And then rename, this is actually very important for a video later on, is change this element's name to start button, change this element's name to exit button. This is important later on when we use the visual scripting graph for accessing these buttons to actually allow them to do what they're supposed to do. So for some aesthetic, let's select the start button and select text, and we're going to increase the size of the text to something like 35. Select the exit button, and do the same thing, jack the size up to like 35. So now we have a functioning panel for the start screen. So let's close the UI builder. And by the way, there are a ton of extra options here. If you're familiar with CSS, you will be very familiar with all this stuff. There's all kinds of stuff you can do. You can do manual position changes. You can change the automatic layout system using the flex options. You can be more specific with how multiple elements are aligned within a container. You can get really specific with the size. You can tweak the margins and paddings. You can tweak the text settings, everything from font to bold to size, color, everything. Background, the border options. You can even get into stuff like very specific transforms. You can change the cursor itself. You can even do certain types of transition animations. And if that's not enough for you, you can even go up here to style sheets, and you can actually create your own custom style sheets. So if you are a CSS hoss, you can get extremely fine-tuned with this. It's essentially bringing web development into the Unity engine, which is something that was pretty much lacking using the old GUI style GUI content system. It was a little bit more convoluted having to do all of this through C# if you weren't too familiar with all of that. For now, I'm going to leave this. It's not super pretty, but it is functional. So I'm going to leave it at this. I'm going to close the UI builder, and as you can see, we now have a panel for the start and exit. Real quickly, I'll enter play mode and double check that the buttons are responsive. And yes, they are. So as you see, if I hover over the buttons, they change their tint a little bit. If I click them, they actually respond. They haven't been hooked up yet. That's something that's going to be done in a later video, but they are ready to get to that point. Had I forgotten to do this part up here, okay, so if you forget the event system, here I'll just turn it off and show you. If you forget the event system and you click play and you go in to the game, the buttons will not be responsive. So that's something to make sure, and it'll give you a nice little warning telling you that you need to do that. So don't forget to do that. And then if you forget to add the UI document option, it will not even show up at all. So make sure you keep all of that in line. So now that we have a relative start screen that will allow us to enter the game and exit the game, we can now move back over to the game scene and start creating the UI for this. So the same thing, first thing we have to do is select the main camera, click add component, add a UI document, add our panel settings that we created, and we need to create a new visual tree asset. So go to assets, right click, create, UI toolkit, UI document, and we will say, give it a split second here to compile. Once it compiles, say game UI. Now that we have the game UI, go back to the camera and select it and insert the game UI. Also, don't forget we have to add an event system to this scene as well. So we'll right click in the hierarchy, go to UI, select the event system, naming it event systems alright, and then make sure to replace it since we're using the input system. Go to the scene view and select the event system, push W, and just make sure it's moved out to the side. Alright, so now that we have that set up, let's double click on the game UI option we just created and pull open the UI builder. So let's select the UXML and then select match game view again. And this is something that's very cool about the UI builder is, and you'll be able to see it in this scene, if we select canvas background, click camera, and then select our main camera, it actually winds up rendering our game scene in the UI builder, which is very convenient for setting everything up. It would be cool to come in here and, if you need to, you come in here and like make it a solid background color, which is really strange because our background color is solid black, but when we use the camera, it's gray. So it's not perfect exactly. There's still a few kinks in the system. We just have to keep in mind that our background is black, it is not gray. So now that we have the setup, we need to add 2 UI elements to this UI scene, which are the 2 scores, for the score for the player and the score for the opponent. So the first thing we're going to do, as in the last part, is we're going to drag a visual element into the hierarchy. We're going to select flex. Make sure you select visual element. Select flex, change the grow to 1. That expands it to fill its entire, whatever contains it, it expands to fill the entire container. Then we are going to add 2 labels to this visual element. We will name the first element opposing score. Once again, it's very important that these names are accurate because these elements are referenced by these names we give them later on in a different video, which is how we actually change these scores at a later time. To simulate these scores, we will go to the text, make it a 0. To simulate a number score, go to the player score and also make it 0. We will change the text. Oh, and to show you something here real quick, I'm about to make all the same changes to both of these scores. However, if you try to do a multi-selection edit, it will come up here and say multi-selection editing is not supported. So unfortunately, that's not supported. So you're going to have to come to the opposing score. You're going to have to go into the text. You're going to have to change its color to black. Player score, go to the text, change its color to black. And then we're going to increase the font size to like 35. Change the opposing score size to like 35. We might even make it a little larger later if we need to. And now we have to fiddle with the layout settings to get this in the right spot. So to lay out multiple elements, the best way to do that is to use their containing element and change the containing element's flex layout options. Not specifically, oh yes, in this instance we do need to choose the flex option and change it to row. And as we see here, they're stacked, but we don't want them to be stacked, we want them to be left to right, so we'll click row, and now they're left to right. Next we will go to the alignment options, and we're going to tweak these a little bit. So right now this is set to stretch, but if you use the stretch, it actually goes from top to bottom, which is not what we want, so instead just switch it over to flex start, and now the elements are simply contained around the size of the font, which is very convenient because if we go here to like opposing score and go back to the text, and we start raising the size, the element auto adjusts to whatever the size is. It doesn't just overflow outside of it, which is pretty convenient. Other layout systems, other UI options will either overflow the text, or it'll cut the text, or it'll like indent the text. In this though, it's just very convenient that it actually just resizes its containing element. It's very convenient. And while we're at it, we will just change the size to 55. Now that we have that set up, go back, select the visual element, and we are going to make another change to the alignment. And that change is going to be the space between option. If we click this space between option, it will automatically simply spread them out like this. And actually we're going to use the space around option, and it's going to put them in a slightly better position. And that is the UI for the game view. Very simple. This is the only actual UI elements that we need are the scores. So if I close this and take a look, we now have the scores set up in the scene. Very simple. It's very simple AI for in the game. Or a very simple UI for in the game. Alright, so there are 2 other UI elements that we need to work on, and that is setting up a pause screen and setting up a victory/defeat screen. I was running into some issues where I couldn't get the pause panel to layer properly inside of the flex system to actually pause inside of the game screen or the game scene. So instead, I'm going to do it a little differently, and we are simply going to use a pause scene, and we are going to use a victory/defeat scene. So the first thing we're going to do is create a new scene. So select the scenes folder, right click, create scene, and we're going to call this pause. Then we're going to jump into this pause scene, and we're going to run through the gamut of everything we've done before. So we'll do UI document, set up the panel settings, really quickly come back up here to the rendering, or excuse me, not the rendering, the environment option. Change it to solid color, change the solid color to black. Right click, UI, add an event system, replace the input system option, drag it outside. Then we will come down, or excuse me, select assets, right click, create, UI Toolkit, create another UI document, and we will simply call this, after a little bit of compilation, we'll simply call this pause UI. Select the main camera, select the pause UI, then open up the pause UI. And this is essentially wash, rinse, repeat from the start menu. It is functionally the same, it's functionally the exact same design, except for we are going to essentially just have the title say pause instead of Pong. So we'll do the same thing here. We'll drag a visual element in. We will set the flex to 1. Then we will add a second visual element, and we will rename this to pause panel. Then we will drag a label onto the pause panel, call this title, and we will change the title's name to paused. Then we will set the pause panel's background to white because the actual background is black. Then we will change the text to black. And I think 55 is actually pretty good for the start screen, so we'll go with that. We will and then we might as well set up the alignments. So we'll come to alignment, and we'll just set them both to centered. So under align items, we'll change it to center, and under justify content, we will also set it to center. Then we will grab the button option and drag 2 buttons onto the pause panel and make sure that they actually nest properly. Once again, we need to rename these and make sure they are named properly. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, because the player is using the escape key to pause and unpause the game, they at least need an exit button. And I guess whatever, we can make it technical and we'll say something like return to start, or yeah, return to start button. And then up here we'll say start. Or we should, to be technical, we'll say return to start. And then this button is the exit, is also an exit button. Same thing, we'll say exit. And for some technicality, we will jump down to the text size, scale the text up to something. It's not too bad. Actually, I want to test this out. So this is what's cool about this. You can, changing one element to actually like adjusts other elements. It's very convenient. Not to focus too much on the aesthetics here, though. We'll set it to 20. It looks pretty good here. If I can get it just right without having to type it. Too late typing. And then select exit button, and same thing, we'll change the size. Get it to match a little bit, so that's like 25. Alright, and now we have a not functioning, but functional pause menu. Similar to how it ran in the start screen. So do a quick test. We'll click interplay mode. And as you can see, everything is responsive as necessary. If I was focusing much more on aesthetics, I would tweak this a lot more using like better spacing. I would pay attention to like the colors more, maybe around the edges, so on and so forth. I'm not too worried on the aesthetics in this particular video. If you would like to focus on the aesthetics more yourself, you have the option to do that. There are a plethora of these options over here. And then if you just happen to be a CSS hoss, you can make your own style sheets and you can go hog wild with this. I'm not going to worry about it right now though. Alright, so that's that winds up being a functional pause screen for the game. Like I said, it would have been really cool to, typically when I make Pong, like when I made Pong for school, I would set it up in the game scene and it would just be like a game object that would turn on and off. So you would like pause the game and then you would like activate this panel with like a little bit of transparency on top of the game scene. But I wasn't able to figure out how to do that here because the layout system doesn't let you stick that panel right in the middle of the screen using the relative scaling. So you have to like build it using the absolute scaling, but then if you switch the absolute scaling options, it like breaks the responsiveness. So to keep the responsiveness and keep the in order to keep the responsiveness and not break the functionality, I wound up just using this little bit of a scene style way to go about this. So we're going to do that one more time then, and we are going to click on Scenes, Create New Scene, and now we are going to, and I'm going to call this the result scene, because the result is either victory or defeat. So we'll click on Result, we will double click it to open it, and now we have to run through the gamut one more time, which I can whip up pretty quickly now that I'm figuring this out. UI document, give it a split second to compile, per the usual, and we will say Result UI. And then we will double click the Result UI, and sorry for the toilet flushing in the background. We will select Match Game View. We will zoom out. We will make sure we match the canvas background to the camera, not that we really need to in this instance, but we can do that here. Make sure to save it real quick, and then add the Result UI to this. Right click, UI, open up the event system, replace it with the input, switch to the scene, drag it out, go back to the game view, and then bring the result UI back up. So a quick aside here. There might be a way to, whenever you start to add elements to this tree, there's a way using C# code to go in there and like custom grab each of the elements. So there might have been a way to do this a little bit more efficiently by essentially having 3 separate visual elements in this group, and using C# code you could turn all of them on and off as necessary. However, I'm still not sure if that would break the layout system or not, so I wound up dodging that just for simplicity in this video. More specifically, what I wanted to do is show a pretty easy setup of getting the UI builder to actually render UI to the screen, and actually just have a pretty comprehensive example of applying the UI builder to make the UI. So I didn't want to muddle up the intent of this video by going down that route. So to finish this up, we need to go through this process one more time. So we'll go to Flex, change the Flex scale to 1. We will grab another visual element, make sure it nests properly. We will call this the result panel. Then we will grab the label element nested in there. We'll call this the result title, or we can just call it title for simplicity. And in here we're going to and actually in this particular instance, so here's the deal. This, depending on if the player wins, this has to say victory, but if the player loses, it has to say defeat. Therefore, the name of this title can't just be title, because there's a point in the game logic where, depending on the score, we actually are going to have to grab this title element in particular and change this text element to say either victory or defeat. So I'm going to give this a more specific title. I'm just simply going to call it the result title. That way we can come back and change it up later. Now that we have the result title set up, let's go back to the visual element and let's change the alignment to be centered. So align items to center, justify content to center. Now we have it centered on the screen. Grab the result panel, go to the background, change the color to white, change the result title text to black. Raise the font size to 55. This usually been what's doing pretty good for this. And I'm pretty sure it will actually auto scale. So when we change it later, it's going to change the size of it automatically depending on whatever the font is. So let's just leave it as victory for now. Next, we'll go down to the controls, grab a button, drag the button onto the result pane, grab a second button and drag it onto the result pane also. Select the first button and we will call this the, once again, it's return to start button, which might yield to some conflicts later on. However, depending on how we query for the elements, there's a good shot that it will have a smart idea of exactly which buttons it's looking for. So naming it return to start and exit I think will be okay. Make sure we change the text on this button to return to start. Change the text on the exit button to exit. Change the font size. What was the font size? And that's like 22. And then the exit button font, change it to 25. And there we go. So now we exit the UI builder. And yes, let's make sure that we switch the environment to a solid color of black for the background. And just to test it and make sure everything works, let's click play and double check that nothing was forgotten here. Give it a moment to compile. And we have responsive buttons. Alright, so I'll switch to the game view real fast and alright, so that is a functioning example of how to use the UI builder it kind of tripped me up real quick because the score wasn't showing up, but okay, so that's why that tripped me up. Let me just click the game UI so it doesn't trip me out. Okay, so that's a functioning example of how to use Unity's UI builder. The UI builder itself is based off of essentially web development. This UXML file is more or less an HTML file. If you actually open this up and take a look under the hood, it's essentially HTML code. U stands for Unity, so UXML stands for Unity Extensible Markup Language, which is, you know, it's a play on HTML, which is like hypertext markup language. So more or less, this is just a Unity-specific HTML, and then the actual customization elements are all based off of CSS. So it's like this is essentially HTML and CSS in Unity to make UIs. And on top of that, you have all these elements that you can just drag into the UI that are already created. You can create your own if you need to, but it has a lot of pre-built functionality by default. You just have to drag it in and make it align properly. And then you can customize it as you need to using the customization options. So it is actually a very powerful tool for generating UIs in your game. It's very likely it could also get used for making UIs for for any web pages you would try to deploy using Unity, which I'm not sure if anybody does that, but it's got the power to do that essentially. It's got a couple kinks here and there, but overall, I'm a huge fan of this UI builder, and I'm a huge fan of the UI toolkit, so I recommend it. Once again, don't forget you need to make sure you add the proper UI document to some game object in your scene. You have to make sure you add an event system to actually register the buttons. You need to make sure you generate a panel settings option. You have to make sure you generate your visual tree assets for separate UIs. And the only thing I didn't really cover in this video would be getting to these UI elements using C# code. But in order to make these buttons actually do stuff when we click on them, I'm going to have to connect certain C# code to them using the visual scripting graph. And that is going to be in a later video. For this video, I just wanted to cover the UI builder in particular, setting up the UI builder and creating UI with the UI builder. A later video is going to actually cover plugging in the functionality for that. Alright, so for now I think that is actually going to be it for this video. Thank you for sticking with it this long. It's been coming on 37 minutes now. If you liked this content, if you like the content I've been creating so far, if you're a fan of what I've been doing, do not be afraid to like, share, and subscribe to this video. And if you're really feeling up to it, do not be afraid to go and support me on my Patreon. I would really appreciate it. In the next video, I'm going to do I actually forgot one thing. Now that we have completed the scene properly, I'm going to do a quick git update to actually commit this as a change. So real quick, let's say git status, and we added a ton of stuff. However, in order to commit this, I don't want to go through the traditional git add and git commit route, because we are still on this Pong challenge branch, and I would like to keep that branch separate just in case I need to revert back to it later. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do, I'm trying to decide if I want to use the new method I figured out or the old method I used to use. If I use the old method, it will actually create a new branch. Okay, so let's just go with that for now. In order to do that, we're going to use our old command git switch. We're going to use the subcommand -c for create, and then we are going to give it a more specific name this time, which is going to be Pong UI. And then we will click enter, and it says it switched to new branch Pong UI. So if I check git status on this branch, it has all the same commits, but at least we're on the new branch. Now that we're in the new branch, we can do the git add star, and that will add everything to the branch. So now if we check git status, everything is actually committed, or excuse me, everything is actually added and it's ready to be committed. So then we will do git commit -m, which will allow us to do a quick message, and we will say committing UI elements for tutorial series. Click enter, and now everything is committed. So one more time, we'll say git status, nothing to commit, working tree clean. Alrighty, so that's everything. In the next video, I am going to go over using something called the input system, which is a way to decouple your definitions for player actions on the keyboard and using the mouse. That allows you to leave player input open to swapping between devices without coupling everything into your code. Because of how few commands this game actually has, that video is going to be way shorter than this video. This video took forever because the UI builder actually has a little bit of meat on its bones. It has a lot to go over. There's a lot more configuration compared to the input system. So the input system video is going to be way shorter. It's going to be a lot easier to absorb, and it's going to be a stepping stone into the final video of this series, which is actually using a visual scripting graph to generate all of the actual gameplay for this game. So if you're interested in seeing how the input system works, make sure to come check me out in the next video. Alright, thank you for sticking with this all the way through. Take care.